Our story today takes place in the wilderness. John, ever since he was a young man, had lived his life in the wilderness, and so he was wearing desert clothes and ate a desert diet. I don't think he would want to be invited to go to lunch at his place, since he was eating bugs and wild honey. But I began to think about that wilderness, desert place. Have you ever felt that your life has just dried up? That you're in some kind of a funk? That you live in the desert place of the soul? St. John of the Cross, in a medieval world, actually a 16th century Carmelite monk, wrote about the dark night of the soul when one encounters emptiness and darkness rather than a feeling of light and lightheartedness. Those are the moments in our lives when prayer just seems to bounce off the ceiling and God seems so far away. In my ministry and in my life, I've experienced many desert places, many wildernesses in my own life. Sometimes they can be in a hospital room. But I've listened also to many people who pour out their hearts that they cannot sense God's presence. They're hesitant to say it out loud, and sometimes they beat around the bush. But after a while it comes out, Pastor, it seems as though God isn't helping me. I pray and I pray, but nothing. I think we all have those kind of moments, those spiritual deserts, those spiritual wildernesses when all seems empty and dry as a bone. And prayer comes only with great effort and is often a pure act of the will with clenched teeth. We wander from time to time in the wilderness, looking for a little oasis, a little spiritual refreshment somewhere, a grace-filled word from a friend maybe, a smile, a hug, a shoulder to cry on, to bring relief to the heart. I think of people who have experienced the death of a loved one, a husband, a wife, a mother, a father. And what a wilderness seems to follow that event. And in this world, not all is sweetness and light. Sometimes we face spiritual deserts and wonder if we can find ourselves a gracious God in the wilderness. And yet John comes on the scene preaching in the wilderness, and people flocked from the big city, from Jerusalem and all Judea to hear him. He came and he described himself from the book of Isaiah as a voice of one calling, "In the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the wilderness a highway for our God." The wilderness, to me, serves as a kind of metaphor for the place that is uninhabited and where life is difficult. This week, on Thursday, I went to the Manor where we hold church services there for some of our members, and a little congregation of other people from other churches have formed. And I read verses from the Gospel of Matthew, the same one Doug read so well this morning, to the congregation at the Manor. And I asked them, when you hear the word wilderness, what comes to mind? And they said loneliness. Wild animals are there. Dryness. Danger, lack of resources. All that is true of wildernesses. And so then I asked the congregation at the Manor, where do you find wilderness and other places in the Bible? Now, many of them know their Bibles very well, and they answered immediately. 40 years of Israel wandering in the wilderness after that Exodus, after they came out of Egypt. When the beleaguered Israelites had been slaves for 400 years and heard the word wilderness or desert, they would immediately thought of their own history, their own story of deliverance, that God brought them out of Egypt. But where did the journey take them? Not immediately straight into the land flowing with milk and honey, but to the desert place, the wilderness. They wandered in that barren land for some 40 years where they tested God and God tested them. And they had learned to depend upon God and only God for their basic necessities. They would gather manna in the morning. They depended upon a rock that gushed forth water for their drink. They caught quail as meat that God sent them. They pitched their tents here and there and moved about, and life for them was difficult. Sometimes, or actually most of the time, according to the text, they complained, they whined. They learned of God through the harsh desert discipline. You couldn't wander far from the camp in that environment alone. People die from doing that, just like in Australia. If you go too far out in the outback and get turned around there, you might not ever come back. But the wilderness is where they first learned the ways of their God. And God was in the wilderness with them in the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud. In the wilderness, they received the 10 words, the 10 commandments that formed them into a people under God's covenant. It was in the desert that they had met God before, when Moses had gone there before and led them back into the desert. They saw the smoke, they saw flashes of brilliant light, and they heard the divine voice rolling like thunder. And now this same God promises to come to them again in the desert, in their desert, in their wilderness of despair and oppression when John comes on the scene. We also talked about how Elijah, one time running for his life when evil Queen Jezebel had put a contract on his head, he went out and found a place in the wilderness and stayed in a cave. He fled to the wilderness and he met God in that lonely place, that tomb-like place that after he met God became a womb-like place where he was reborn in his mission. But God was in the wilderness with Israel, and God was in the wilderness with the prophet. The folks at the manor also identified that Jesus began his ministry in the wilderness by praying and fasting for 40 days and nights. That God was in the wilderness with Jesus. It said he was with the wild animals. Angels ministered to him. And Jesus came out of that wilderness energized with a fresh vision of God and a burning passion to serve God. God is present in our wildernesses, even those moments that we don't feel him and can't sense him. He comes to us, gathers us up in his arms, and is carrying and loving us even when we don't feel it. He comes to us in the wilderness. Maybe you're not in the desert place today. Maybe the bills are all paid, the kids are happy and healthy, and you have life by the tail. Maybe your job is secure and the rent is paid in full. But for so many, life is like a vast desert, a wilderness of arid spirituality. What is your desert today? How might God come to you in the moments of your deprivation? Has your marriage run out of love? Are you going through the motions, but love died long ago? One man was suffering from a serious marital breakdown. With tears and anger vented to me one day, he said to my wife, "I'm no more than a credit card. She's reduced me to a piece of plastics. That's all I am to her." He was in a desert place. Or maybe your health has been broken. Something has happened and now you live a slower, less active, a diminished life. Maybe over the telephone you heard the dreaded words, the test came back positive, the tumor is malignant. We recommend chemotherapy as soon as you can. Could Thursday be a good day for you? Or for some people, it's what a mess they've made of their lives due to some bad choices, and that can bring on a desert. What about destruction that is occasioned by sin? That marriages have suffered irreparable damage when a business went away from home, lonely and surrounded by interesting and beautiful people, fell into temptation and committed an act that follows them around like a 5-pound weight in guilt until the marriage finally snaps. That's a desert. I thought I paid my dues, Pastor. I thought I'd paid my dues. Or maybe you're suffering with a sustained and life-draining depression, where it seems that everything takes such effort and you've just lost your mojo. But the good news is this. God comes to us in our wilderness with words of comfort and words of hope and the promise of his presence whether we feel it or not. When he said these words, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Lo, I'm with you always, Jesus said, even into the end of the age. Fear not. Do not fear. Have no fear. Be not anxious, Jesus tells us. Jesus reaches out his strong arms and embraces us all. He reaches out his arms, not when times were good, but when they nailed his hands and his feet to the wooden cross. And that is how he embraces us, and in fact he embraces the whole world. That's how he gathers us in his arms and carries us close to his heart. And though all around us we may see the wilderness and hear the arid winds howling and feel the scorching sun and the chill of the night, though we taste the salt of our own sweat and feel the blast of the burning winds in our faces, still hear the word of the Lord that will never pass away when it says, the glory of the Lord will be revealed and all humankind will see it, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. Though it tarries, wait for it, because God will come to the desert with healing words and transforming power. The desert and the parched land will be glad, the prophet says. The wilderness will rejoice and blossom like the crocus. It will burst into bloom. It will rejoice greatly and shout for joy. Strengthen the feeble hands. Steady the knees that give way. Say to those with fearful heart, be strong, do not fear. Your God will come. He will come to save you, and water will gush forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. Those are healing and good words. Sometimes that's what we cling to. That's what we hold to. Just a quick story. While I was in the hospital, and now I've been biblical, 40 days and 40 nights, 7 different trips. This last time I was there, I had 2 nurses. Both were named Olga. One was morning, one was night shift, and they were having to work on me at one time, at the same time. They were good friends of each other. One's from Russia, one's from Belarus. Stephanie had brought my watercolor kit, so I was doing some little sketches in watercolors right there. And one of the Olgas said, you do watercolor? I said, yeah, I teach a little class of kids on Monday nights. And they come and we do watercolor. She said, can my kids get involved? I said, sure. So Dimitri and Misha joined our class last Monday, a week ago when we had it, and they're going to be joining us again tomorrow night. So you never know where God may be present and use whatever you have to offer, even in the desert. Amen?
Amen.
Amen. Let's stand together and sing, Wild and Lone the Prophet